coming up with the actual definition of words. Reading Standard 4 is more rigorous, I would argue. It moves into why. Why?
Choose to use this figurative language versus the literal.
Exactly. Bingo. That's more the spirit of Reading Standard 4. Why is the writer using this particular vocabulary? Good example.
That would get into the difference of reading for information versus reading for pleasure.
Exactly. Well said. You get into the difference of reading for pleasure versus reading for information. You know, vocabulary, Reading Standard 4 for nonfiction. Why is the writer using technical vocabulary? To teach you something.
Author's purpose.
Author's purpose, exactly. So that you become familiar with language associated with, in this case, baseball. In science, it's going to be something else. Right? Okay, writing question. Go ahead.
We said, how did his father's opinion of Babe Ruth affect the poet's description of him?
Say that one more time. Ooh, I like it. I didn't hear it quite all the way through. Read it one more time.
How did his father's opinion of Babe Ruth affect the poet's description of him?
Whoa, that's a good writing question. That's a really good writing question. Love it. It's not looking for an essay, but that's a pretty rigorous question.
Yeah.
I think students would do much better on that writing question if they were involved with you on your pre-reading questions and your discussion questions. Much better. Much, much better. Okay, one thing that I want to circle back on is that very important question of how these two passages are similar and different.
That was our discussion.
So let's talk about that. Let me say this. If you get a paired text situation with students, you have them read at least two texts on the same topic. Almost certainly, there's going to be a lot of similarity between the two texts. Generally speaking, a little bit less in terms of the differences. That's where students, I think, really need to pay attention. The similarities between these two texts, I think, are pretty obvious, aren't they? But let's briefly talk about them. How are these two texts similar?
They both talk about what made him a good baseball player.
Yes, you get a lot of information in both passages about what made him one of the best players ever. Good.
Like the point of view is the same. They're both pretty positive about him.
Yes, agreed. Both authors are pretty positive about Babe Ruth. Agreed?
There's factual information in both.
Say it again.
There's factual information in both.
Good, we've got facts in both. Okay, let's transition. How are these passages actually different? In the information that they give. I want to be clear on that. You would probably say, well, one's a report and the other's a poem. And you're right. But what I want you to do is think about the information that you're getting about Babe Ruth. How are these two passages actually giving us different information? Or what does one give us that the other doesn't give us?
Stated facts.
Stated facts, details. Which of the two passages actually gives us more detail? The first one. Right. Here's what I want you to do, because this is a really good exercise to go through with students. It's just a key detail question. What I want you to do is make a T-chart on a piece of paper. And really what I want you to focus on actually just one side of the T-chart. The left-hand side could be similarities on how Babe Ruth was great. The other side could be differences in how he was great. So what I really want you to focus on is the differences. Okay. I want you to go back into these texts. I want you to be specific in giving, I don't know, 3, 4 examples of how these texts give us different information about how Babe Ruth was just a fantastic baseball player. Okay? And then we'll come back together and share out.
Are you looking for more general stuff, like this side mentioning fact, specific facts, like batting statistics, this one didn't, or are you looking for like, this one specifically says he was a pitcher, this side this?
I think you can interpret it either way. Yeah. Either of those approaches would be really good.
Well, I would say there's not Right, I'm saying they still voted whether you told them
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's how
It'll take about another minute. Okay, time. I don't think that your students would have much trouble with the similarities. I think it's a good idea to slow down with the differences, though. So, what differences did you come up with?
Right, so we talked about, like, I underlined the things that made him great in the first article, and then the things that made him great in the second article.
Okay.
And in the first one, you come up with many more, like, statistics,
Mm-hmm.
numbers, specifics, things that can be backed up with data.
Yes.
Then in the second one, if you come up with things that can be backed up by just a fan watching the game and his opinion of Babe Ruth. So we said one of a home run hero. Okay, well, that was written much more informally, but he was a home run hero. In the second article, in the first one, it actually says he had 714 home runs.
That's right.
And so it's just the way that they reference it from informal language to formal language.
That's right. Good observation. In passage B, you get this one phrase that says a home run hero. In passage A, though, you get a lot of concrete information about how he hit a lot of home runs. Good observation. Dixie, what'd you say?
The same thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot more facts, like he learned his baseball skills from one of the teachers at his school. I mean, it's more
Oh, yeah.
details.
That's right.
that Didn't talk about where he started out. there.
Good, yes, good reading. The second passage, the poem, doesn't say anything about his young life and, not really,
And how he started out.
how he started out, yeah. So you could predict why it's a good idea for students to be thinking through both the similarities and the differences. When we get to the essay, it's not an uncommon assignment. If students get an informational essay prompt, which we'll look at in just a second, for them to talk about the similarities and differences. So let's look at an example. I'll say this, with the students with whom I've worked, their essays are generally much stronger in a paragraph about the similarities than they are the differences.
The differences here are so much more complex.
Yep. Back to talking. Get students talking about the differences. I don't think that you probably aren't going to need to have much conversation about the similarities. I would slow down though and have some conversation about the differences. It's a little bit more subtle. All right. Let's finish up by looking at some an essay prompt and then just a few actual student responses. And then it's on the road to the national champion. Oh, she's already gone. Okay, there we go. Same kind of thing that we saw with short constructed response. What I want you to do is think about, is there anything in the prompt that your students would struggle comprehending? Then let's talk about that, okay?
Off the field. Yeah.
This was created by a group of classroom teachers. There are parts of this prompt that I'm not nuts about and would change, but there's a lot in this prompt that I really like. I like way more than I don't like. There's some ambiguity in language for elementary school kids that I think should get tightened up, and I heard some of you say it. For instance,
Do this.
what is this?
Yeah.
That can be a little bit ambiguous to some. It can be ambiguous to you and me. So we could reword that, make it clearer. Anything else that jumps out at you is, I think my students would struggle understanding what's meant by relevant, back to that conversation about relevance. That's a nice piece to talk about. What does relevant mean in this situation?
Has to do with being a great baseball player.
That's right. You've got to be focused on how he was a great baseball player. The passages talk about how he was great in some similar ways, but as we talked about just a second ago, they also talk about how he was great in some different ways. And those differences are, you got to read more carefully to pick up on those differences. The similarities are probably just going to jump right out at you. Not an uncommon sort of prompt. And I'll show you some responses in just a second. But like we talked about, a lot of actual responses that I've seen to this one, a lot more strength in talking about the similarities than the differences. One question that I do have for you before we go on and look at some student responses is planning. What might it look like for your students, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, to plan in a meaningful way, but at the same time, a way that's not going to take a ton of time? T-chart, I think, could work really nicely here. And I kind of had to do that. Similarities on one hand, differences on the other. And at the top of the T could be what statement?
Yeah, greatest, but, I mean, like, let's stay relevant.
Yeah, one of the greatest baseball players of all time. You get that at the top of your T, I think you're much more likely to stay on point.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So a T-chart could work really nicely here for students. That's not the only kind of planning approach that I think could work well here, though. Any other ideas come to mind? Venn diagram could work. One thing that I would love your opinion on this. I have seen some elementary school students struggle with how a Venn diagram actually works. Have you seen that? Some do, some don't. Some of you are shaking your heads no, which isn't surprising. But it kind of serves the point that there are a lot of different ways that you could plan. You need to play to your strengths, right? Don't use a planning tool that's going to confuse you, right? Any other ideas come to mind? T-chart, Venn diagram. Here's a question I have for you that I have for a lot of elementary school kids. You know this is an essay. By the way, how do we know it's an essay? Tells you.
Right, an essay.
Good reading. We know an essay has an introduction. We know an essay has a conclusion. We know an essay has a certain number of body paragraphs. My question to you is this. How many body paragraphs are you going to include in your response?
At least 2.
What would the 2 be? You could have one body paragraph about the similarities. You could have another body paragraph about the differences. That seems to make sense. Any other options that come to your mind?
I would do one with similarities and then one with like outline differences and another one and outline differences. To me, I mean, I don't think that makes sense.
Say that one more time.
Like the similarities would be one paragraph because you're comparing them, so they're obviously going to be the same. But then the difference is things that you pull out of Article 1 and then things you pull out of Article 2 would
Yeah.
be 2 different paragraphs.
Oh, I got you. Sure, that makes sense. Generally speaking, I would be very, very inclined to move students away from a 5-paragraph format. Why do I say that? 5-paragraph essay has been taught for a long time.
Because I think they lose relevance when they're trying to only think about, oh my gosh, I only have 4 paragraphs
what am I gonna put in this other paragraph, so they pull crap that ain't relevant.
Totally. That's actually very well put.
Thanks. People don't say that about me very often.
Think about that. How many of you have seen students struggle mightily when it comes to, all right, if I'm supposed to do 5 paragraphs in an essay, and I'm trying to respond to this prompt, what in the world should I put into my third body paragraph? It's probably not going to be very strong.
My kids struggle with concluding though, or I've seen ours struggle with concluding.
Sure.
Because, well, we've already studied the differences, we've already studied the similarities, so how am I gonna write the file and then tie all that together when I've already stated it?
I don't have a magic answer to that, but here's what I would say. I'm not surprised if students in their conclusions to an informational essay like this one are somewhat repetitive. They're kind of providing an overview of what they've talked about. And honestly, there's precedent for that. I mean, in a lot of technical writing, in a lot of informational writing.
We've already said this, why do I need to say it again? How am I gonna put it all back together?
Mine would have to say 5 paragraphs.
Yet another reason we move away from the 5 paragraph format.
Mine will write, my story is about.
They're gonna be,
No,
I'm still getting major tips, you know, when I'm talking high school and going to college and all
Yeah.
that, they're gonna be graded on that. And I think that's why we've stuck so much with that 5 paragraph essay, is because, you know, your college entrances and things like, even our, way back when I took the practice survey, and it was graded on, did you have introduction, conclusion, and early information, well developed
Yeah.
paragraphs?
Here's what go ahead. Kyle brought up a good point. What about later on? When kids are responding to essays, aren't they going to need to do 5 paragraphs?
Yeah, but you develop them too as you get older. Things just come more, not natural, but
At this age, they need the
you
structure.
have more knowledge, you have more.
well, their first grade, they're gonna make how long? There's not gonna be 2 paragraphs in both, it's gonna be all together. Third grade, they're catching and right, they're just gonna be all together.
Right.
I mean, it's gonna be,
Right.
I mean.
Here's what I'd say about, when I was in the English department, we had constant conversation of how, like, all these kids are writing 5 paragraph essays. That we need to move beyond this. I mean, if you sit down on an AP exam, I mean, think about some of the prompts. You may not be thinking about them right now. Let me give you an example. You get 10 articles on whether universities should have honor codes. And the consequence of violating the honor code is expulsion. For instance, my father-in-law was at the University of Virginia, where there's an honor code. And they never locked their dorm rooms, ever. If something was stolen and you were found out, you were out. There's no tolerance for this. So you get 10 articles in that context. Some of the articles are very pro honor code. Some of them are very con honor code. Your job. Write an argumentative essay on whether universities should have honor codes. Be sure to support your position with evidence from 4 of the 10 articles. There's nothing in that prompt that lends itself to a 5-paragraph theme. Does that make sense? You need to pay attention to what the prompt is asking you to do, is what I'm saying. More often than not, let me be clear though, are there some instances where a 5-paragraph approach makes sense? Yes. Yes. But you gotta pay attention to what's being asked of you. That's all I'm saying. I think most kids, say it again.
What you're saying is there's no set formality really of how many paragraphs you should have, as long as you answer.
Because your
You're being
body
asked.
can be as many paragraphs as you
Still
need.
saying there's still a conclusion, there's still a.
I think you're
Yeah.
right.
Yes, there are those
But
pieces.
the
Yep.
but the number of paragraphs in between doesn't have to be 3 or
Interchangeable.
2, or as long as you address each.
It's just like if you ask me a question, I may answer it in 5 minutes, We could say the same thing in 3 minutes.
You're so right. There's variation. Let me say this, if you teach the 5-paragraph format, it is not that difficult to move away from it. Because a lot of the same elements are still going to be a part of your teaching of the essay. For instance, you need an introduction here, agreed?
Yes.
You need a conclusion here, agreed?
Yes.
Really, all you're saying is, unless you feel like it makes sense to you, have fewer than 3 body paragraphs in the body of your essay. It's not that big of a transition to move students in that direction. I am worried constantly about young kids in particular, feeling really frustrated about, like, what am I supposed to say in my 3rd paragraph? They're not wrong. You would feel the same way. Does that make sense? All right, let's look at some examples. Oh, the essay, at least on end of grade assessments, gets 2 scores.
Say that again?
Yep. Thank you for being honest.
Sorry.
I know it happens. The essay, at least on end of grade assessments, gets 2 scores. It gets a score in trait 1. There it is. It gets a score in trait 2. What's trait 2? Grammar, usage, mechanics, conventions, that's it, the language standards. Trait 1 is basically, did you answer the prompt? How well did you develop it? How well did you organize it? Okay. I'm going to do a little bit of color coding here. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to show you one example, and we'll talk about it, and then a few more comments. Controlling idea. That's actually a term that's a leftover from the old grade 5 writing assessment, the old grade 3 writing assessment. What is a controlling idea?
We got to get the whole.
Yeah, kind of what the whole thing's about. Kind of like a main idea. You know, it's interesting. I think you could well argue that the controlling idea is given to you in the prompt. What is the controlling idea going to be in an essay like this one? Yeah, Babe Ruth was one of the greatest players of all time. The 2 passages talk about this in similar and in different ways. Your main points. Kids should not overthink this. Similarities. Differences. These are like topic sentences. This is where most of the points are going to get picked up. The details that you bring in from the passages that on one hand show similarities, and then the details from the passages on the other hand that show differences. The top scores have this, in addition to relevant textual details. Further elaboration on those details, which brings up an interesting question. How can we help students elaborate further on textual details that they bring in? It's all going to be related to background knowledge. Let me show you an actual student response where there's plenty of this. And I want you, and I'm going to include myself in this mix, to think about the following question. How is the student elaborating? What is the student drawing on? Almost certainly it's going to be background knowledge. To elaborate. Here it goes. Top score on the scale, that's score point 4. Can everybody see this okay? Would somebody mind reading it out loud? Yeah, go ahead.
The authors of the passage A and B both have the same main idea. Babe Ruth is one of the greatest players of all time. How do they develop this idea in similar and different ways? Well, let's start with how they're similar. Both passages give details about all the great things Babe Ruth did on the field. In passage A, it says that Ruth is considered by many to be the greatest player of all time. From all of his home runs to all of the records he broke, it is obvious he was a great baseball player. Also, in passage B, it says he was a pitcher and a catcher. Not many can make the claim of George Herman Ruth, Jr., a first in the Hall of Fame. If not many can be a pitcher and a catcher, he must be great at baseball to do both. The passages are also different. Passage A gives facts about the great things Babe Ruth did off the field. In the fourth paragraph, the author says Babe Ruth made appearances in support of veterans during World War II and accepted appearances to talk with young athletes. Passage B doesn't give as many facts about the great things Babe Ruth did off the field. It just says things like Babe inspired children and supported troops at war. So passage A gives more facts about how Babe Ruth was great off the field. That's probably because it's a report, but passage B is a poem. Passage A and B both have the same main idea. Together they prove that Babe Ruth truly was one of the greatest baseball players of all time, on and off the field. There are many similarities in how the passages describe Ruth's greatness. There are also a few differences.
Not surprisingly, in the conclusion there, we get a little bit of repetition.
Yeah.
Okay. Thoughts on this essay overall?
I don't know that our children would have separated on and off the field.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think they would have done similarities.
Just general,
In general.
Yeah. Here's another thing I would say, is if the student just focused on Ruth's on-the-field accomplishments and didn't really get into the off-the-field stuff, there would be some latitude, considerable latitude given. Why?
Because that's really how he was the greatest player, is because of his statistics, not what he.
That's
did
right.
on the field.
You're so right. Furthermore, the two passages don't really talk a whole lot about what he did off the field. They talk a little bit about how he was off the field, but not much.
Not really an introduction.
It's a fairly minimal introduction, but it's still got a form. So let's focus on the strengths. There are some weaknesses. Talk to me about what's going on in the body paragraphs. That is so good.
The action.
And they elaborated on the details that's underlined in each paragraph.
Right, so the further
Exactly where they
original,
got it.
say it again.
You know exactly where that came from.
You know exactly where they, so the student gives credit to the author.
They know what they're talking about. They know what they read.
Perfectly said. This student not only writes very well, this student has read very well. No doubt. Let's go back to that question. So these details in green, they come from where? Come from the passages. The underlined details, where do they come from?
Elaboration.
That's the elaboration piece. So how is this student, I hope this question makes sense. How is this student elaborating?
Tying his personal knowledge, personal feelings to during that.
Yes, that's very nicely put. I think he's tying, or she's tying, personal feelings to these textual details. So for instance, he was a pitcher and a catcher. What a great observation on the part of the student. If not many can be a pitcher and a catcher, he must be great at baseball to be both. That's good thinking. That is an amazing insight down here. I mean, I wouldn't expect a lot of fifth grade kids to have that kind of an insight. But, oh no. Go ahead. But it's a good insight. Who's done a mini lesson where you kind of have main point? Babe Ruth was great. Textual detail. How he was great. How do we know that? 714 home runs. And then it's the student's job to add one sentence where they elaborate on that textual detail. 714 home runs. Even if it's just an opinion.
Wow, that's awesome.
Or something. Bingo. Seriously. If a student went the next step and said, that's awesome. That's an amazing thing. It's going to get the kid noticed. Now that's a fairly simple kind of opinion, but it's, I tell you what, it's on point. I'll say this. and you could back me up on this, or you could refute this. Most elementary school students that I've worked with, their elaboration is not necessarily the most sophisticated. Some third, fourth, and fifth grade kids do have some fairly sophisticated elaboration. Case in point. But more often than not in elementary school, it's fairly simple. What a great exercise, though. What a great habit of mind to get students into. Other people have said to me that elaboration, that's where the real thinking is occurring. I can't agree more. So forget about the essay. I mean, you could just chunk things down to a mini lesson where the focus is on main point, textual detail that goes with that main point, and it's the student's job. Elaborate with one or two sentences. Let's go for one.
How do you teach elaboration if the child is lacking background knowledge on background?
Yeah, it's a good point.
That comes in with your discussion, I would think.
There you go, yeah. Back to discussion.
on the milestone.
That's the thing. yeah.
There's no discussion on milestones.
There's not.
But let me say this. If we did this kind of talking about what we're reading before writing in the classroom, how could that potentially carry over to milestone?
All strategies, I mean, they've got it here, you know.
I'm getting a good sense by talking with you about the things that I should be reading for. If my pre-reading questions in the classroom are as simple as, do I know anything at all about the topic? Does it seem to be a nonfiction text or a fiction text? What else do I notice about it? Those are great things that students can do on their own.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's true.
Now, I want to be clear, I agree with you that it's not a perfect match. I mean, when you and I are reading on our own, it's never a perfect match for reading in community.
Especially if the topic